Hi, I'm Chris Folmsbee. I'm the president of Burlap. I'm here with my friend Brad Hanna. Brad and I have been around a long time together, over a decade. We've done everything from coach baseball and basketball together to serve in the church alongside a small group in Sunday school classes and all kinds of things. We've led spiritual retreats together. One of the things that Brad and I do a lot is just figure out ways to find time, carve that time out to have conversations about the church. Brad's really passionate about the church, as I am, and Brad actually is really instrumental in helping us start Burlap. It began at his house around a fire pit one day when Brad said, "Look, I just finished this study on millennials. Do you think we could help churches with this stuff?" And I'm like, yeah, I think we probably could. And Burlap really came out of that. So the other day, I'm sitting here talking with Brad about some things we're going to get to. You see this chocolate bar, you see the morsels. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But before we do, I want to have you have a chance to just get to know Brad just a little bit. So Brad, why don't you just share a little bit about who you are, what you do, and sort of what led you to where you are now in life.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I'm a executive vice president, director of business strategy for a marketing communication firm here in Kansas City, and one of the things I've really focused on since 2009 is actually leading some of the largest studies that have ever been done studying the millennial generation. One of the things that I do in my everyday life, working with big brands that you'll see across grocery store shelves or restaurants or retailers that are out there, is actually help those brands that are struggling with millennials. There's a lot of categories out there in the marketing world where they are very strong with boomers and very engaged with boomers, but when it comes to the millennial generation, they just don't have that following. They've lost household penetration. They've lost, what we call buy rate or participation rate. Everything is just not connecting with the millennial audience. And one of the things we do is use our insights and our research to help brands really overcome how to make your brand more relevant to that generation, how to actually bring your brand to that generation to where they want to engage with you. So a lot of the conversations that Chris and I have had over, fire pits at night is really talking about how do you put some of the principles of what brands do that are struggling with millennials and put those applied to the church and to faith-based organizations, which is what we'll talk about.
Yeah, and about a week or so ago, Brad and I were hanging out one Friday afternoon just as our week was winding down. We just get together a lot of times just to chat. We connect with a bunch of guys. We talk about the church. We talk about life. We talk about faith. We talk about families. And one of the things that came up is that Brad had just come back from a candy conference, and he had just been doing some workshops and things, leading some people through exactly with the kinds of things that he just mentioned, helping brands understand how to connect with millennials. And he said something to me that kind of just resonated with me, or at least it piqued my interest first, and that was, he said, the church is like chocolate. And at first I was like, what are you talking about? And then the more I heard Brad talk about the church was like chocolate, the more I began to understand, wow, I think that there's an analogy here that the church needs to be made aware of in order that we might live into our mission and live into the opportunity for us to reach millennials and Generation Z. And I think most churches that we interact with would say they're either doing a fair job or a poor job. And one of the things Burlap wants to do is Burlap wants to help churches do a great job. We want to change the narrative from a narrative of decline to a narrative of vibrancy and health and growth. And so one of the things we want to do is help churches think through, are they like chocolate? The chocolate industry. Is that a fair way to say that?
That's fair.
Yeah. So why don't you talk a little bit about what we shared last week when we got together about how churches like chocolate?
Yeah, so as I'm sitting here studying the chocolate industry recently, one of the big things that's plagued chocolate is that since 2005 into 2006, that whole industry has been on a steady decline, up to 3%, annually. They're declining with consumers. So, what that means is that chocolate's got an identity problem. Chocolate is no longer as relevant or as meaningful with consumers. And what's interesting is if you ask people, do you like chocolate, you rarely get someone who says no. There's an amazing craving for chocolate. It serves an important role for chocolate. So one of the things that is interesting about that is if everyone is really craving this great treat, then why is it declining? And a lot of it has to do with this right here, that this is the main form of chocolate as a lot of people. It's this big old honk of a chocolate bar, and what we're finding is that the way we're serving up chocolate is actually the way that people are finding less relevancy and meaning about it. And I think what's interesting is that's really what you look at the church, and what's plaguing the church right now with that struggle with millennials. In a study that I just did this past year, we talked to people who are over the age of 21, and we asked them, and this is my research, so it's not research with church, it's researchers with, marketing across the country for consumers. But one of the things we found is that across the board, 61% of people consider themselves to be spiritual, which is great. That's a really high number. Anytime you get above 60% on anything, you're starting to get, a real mass connection there. But when you look at how many people are actually engaged in regular attendance of a religious service, that's 35%. And that's a pretty significant gap. It's about 26 points. When you then look at millennials, that gap jumps to 30. Wow. So there's 30% gap between millennials who say they are spiritual and millennials who attend a church service regularly. Well, in our job, we call that the opportunity gap. And if your opportunity gap is that big, that means you have one of two things: a huge opportunity to close that gap, or a huge problem and why that gap exists today. Mm-hmm. And I think, and that's what we really look, in the nest of what really the connection to chocolate is because so many people are craving chocolate, but yet when you look at the way they're serving it up, that's not the way that they want to have it.
So, people are craving chocolate, right? And we know that. You've even quoted some statistics to tell us that, there's a decline in chocolate, nevertheless, even with the craving.
Yeah.
So, if we were to understand this chocolate bar as the church, right, we would say people want chocolate. People want spirituality. They want faith. What they don't want is the way the church is serving it up, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe an alternative way to think about it is this cup of chocolate morsels that is probably, I don't know if it's the exact same amount of chocolate in there between the cups, but it's a different way of thinking about how churches can close this or respond to maybe this opportunity gap that you talked to. The opportunity is connecting people to faith, connecting people to spirituality, and the church's role in doing that. But if we're serving up a chocolate bar when people really just want the ingredient, right, there's a miss.
Yeah.
So what would be some ways you would think about the church can respond to culture, because we're called to do that, right? I think one of the biggest challenges for churches is they go, nope, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're good at. We put all our money in this sort of basket, so to speak. We put it all in the chocolate bar. And the resources aren't distributed across maybe the church in such a way that allows people to get outside the church and share it in more morsel fashion, right?
Yeah.
So what would be some ways you would think you might say to a church leader who was listening to this saying, well, that's great, I get it, right? The church is like a chocolate bar. We need to change the way we're serving it. The craving hasn't gone down, just the way people want it has changed. How might they adapt some new principles, new practices for their church to reach a generation that we call an opportunity?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm going to go back to chocolate, because the chocolate industry, obviously, these are big brands with lots of money and lots of not going to sit still when things are declining. So what did they do to reverse it? Well, there's two big things that are happening right now that are helping reverse this trend. One is they're breaking down to bite-sized. And man, what a difference that's making. Bite-sized chocolates is actually growing at an amazing rate right now. It's up there in that, 6% rate. So instead of eating that big bar, I may give you a couple of these, and I'll put them in a little bag, and then you can kind of choose when you want them. Because guess what? If I can engage in a little bite of chocolate, that gives me the same reward, the same indulgence, the same emotional feeling of comfort, is actually without the guilt, without any baggage, without any reservation that I have when I try to go all in. So it's interesting that the chocolate bar has said, I'm going to give you that same experience, but I'm going to give it to you you in little smaller pieces, so it's easier for you to engage. It's easier for you to, justify. It's easier for you to make time for in my life versus the big one. The other one is that the chocolate industry has just looked at where are the emerging needs for millennials today. And you know what that is? It's not confections, it's called snacking. And snacking is now one of the fastest growing eating occasions. It's over 50% of the meal occasions that people have. And what the chocolate industry has realized is that while people feel snacking is more relevant for their life, snacking with a little bit of chocolate is wonderful. So what the chocolate industry's done is actually taken, what used to be this big, commitment where you've got to come to it, and they've actually taken their morsels and they've brought that to where people are going as an ingredient. So what I love about that is that when I add chocolate to something that you're doing already, it all of a sudden makes that experience just as great, as if I'd have the big thing. And it makes it more rewarding and more meaningful. So when I look at how do you apply that to the church, that's where I get to what are we doing to bring down bite-sized pieces? What are we doing to bring bite-sized moments versus asking for the huge commitment of you come when I tell you to come to my church and go all in. Well, as you know, people that are deeply committed in their faith, Sunday church is awesome. Sunday church is the moment where I rekindle my faith. It re-energizes me. It challenges me. It deepens me. But if that's for deeply or people who are on that journey, if I'm down here and just newly trying to understand how do I go from spiritual to kind of a more commitment, man, don't take me to the big chocolate bar. I'm not ready. That's asking for too much.
We meet with a lot of churches. We help a lot of churches, and we want to continue to help you. Just visit us at thinkburlap.com. You'll see Brad's picture there. You can interact with Brad through the email if you have questions for him. You can catch up with me there as well. Just thinkburlap.com. Thanks for listening. And remember, today is not about being in the chocolate bar, but about being the morsels.